Right. Today's theme, Oh Brave New World. The world being a lot less bright and braver after Trump's won today, I think. It's the sort of elephant in the room here. The day's as bad as Brexit was. Utopias are appropriate, particularly this year, to think about to some degree, because it is, of course, the 500th anniversary of Thomas More's book. But of course, the whole point about More's book and the word itself coming from the Greek, utopia means no place, which is singularly appropriate. Now, the Fenlands have variously attracted utopian schemes and visionary enterprises, partially because of the sense of the availability of land, the sense of its flatness, and also the straightness of its drainage works. And these range from Cressy Dymock's 17th century models of ideal farms, as you see in the top right here. One could think about also the very fact that Row Bottom did its flat earth trawls out along the Bedford level because of its straightness, and there are a number of others. And to this can also be added the experimental tracked hover train, whose trawls were conducted along the Bedford level, but from Erith to Sutton in the early 1970s, the plug being pulled by Heseltine in '73. Now, my interests in these came from our work at Haddam when we were there in the 1980s. And it's just the very fact that there's a round barrel sitting here in the Bedford level, Bronze Age barrel, and one was looking up the barrels and then wondering what in the world all this stuff was down the side of the Bedford level, which of course is the tracked hover train facility. Now, along with particularly monorails, there's a long pedigree to these types of adventure enterprises. They're the kind of things that feature in Disneyland and World's Fairs. And there seemed like a way of sort of acknowledging the future is now when basically cities or fairs take on decide to build them. And they're still today seen as great answer to traffic woes. I mean, it was only last year that, we're jumping all over the place here. Only last year that Cambridge announced that, again, it would be the answer to having, and who knows, maybe we will get our monorail. But it's very much the sense of the enterprise and a few visionary future schemes. Now, for our recording work that we did for what's left of the remnants of the hover train facility, it'll shortly be out on YouTube featuring our local resident expert, Eddie Edwards, who's very much featuring in the interviews of it. Our main area of recording was in the Sutton Gullet, where they still have where the stanchions still survive, and the piles here. And what's interesting is that this is basically where the project seems to have fallen foul for the most part of why the plug was pulled. The fact that they couldn't actually route the stanchions deep enough, and so you had these pile bases here, and that they couldn't get the piles to go down. That being said, they still achieved speeds of 100 miles per hour over 1 mile. They were aiming for 300 miles an hour. If you think about it, it was going to be the HS2 of its day. Now, the reason for the failure is basically that they didn't take account of the paleotopography of the fen. So that the route here's the Sutton Gullet here, and if you look, and you can also see it on the Moore map, it's the weaving paleo course of the old river course of the River Great Ouse going on, snaking underneath it. And we've cored this elsewhere before. And we know it goes well over 5 meters depth. And that it's not surprising they couldn't actually find a way of routing the piles in, but they didn't take account of nature. And of course, there's a certain degree of hubris in all this. The sense of nature fights back against the vanity of human intentions. Now, the whole thing today has quite an air of sort of great follies. The prototype you pass on the train for the facility, which is up at Railroad World in Peterborough, the thing that looks like something out of Star Trek from the railway line you can see. And it's one of these kind of sad reminders of the future that might have been. So anyways, the film will be up probably within about 2 weeks' time. We have this special thing at Mike Petty's Friday session in Ely this week, where one of the original engineers is coming to talk and is bringing a box full of archives. So we're getting that filmed, which should be very promising. Now to the main event, which is our work on the Manea Colony. This part of the talk was meant to be given by Marcus Britton, who excavated the site, but unfortunately he's had to attend a funeral today, so you're stuck with me. Now, one of the most prominent 19th century socialist reformers was Robert Owen, who entered into his family business in 1800 at the age of 29 and managed the new Lanark cotton mills. And during that began to conceive that improvements to the working and living conditions of his workforce would improve productivity. Models for work, he argued, should translate into models for life. And the best route of productivity was through cooperative being, which was not just a way of life, but a state of mind, a new moral world, as it were. Health, happiness, and prosperity would be the outcome of this, and to achieve it required an exemplar model or experiment, the success of which, the idea of running this kind of experiment, would convince the rest of the world to follow a similar course. Now, Owen's ideas were not met with great welcome in the UK, surprisingly enough, and progress for his schemes was slow. So instead, he decided to establish a new community in America in 1825 and stayed there until 1827. His family remained in the States with the work under the direction of his son, but Owen himself returned to the UK to sell his new Lanark business, and he used the proceeds to further promote his socialist ideals. Now, the key element of these ideals was based upon the sense of community ground plans, which were based on quadrangles. And these provided an ordered space at whose centers of these communities were meant to be the communal rooms and also productive gardens. Dormitories would separate unmarried boys and girls, with married partners having their own separate wing of the quadrangle. Children proper would be raised by the community, but would have direct access to their parents. Education and learning would take place within the quadrangle itself, but there was always this idea that there was potential for adding further quadrangles through time. Now this leads us to William Hobson and Manea Fen. Hobson was a successful businessman living in Upwell, and he ran various businesses based around his agricultural practice. In 1838, he attended one of Robert Owen's lectures in Wisbech, and it appears to have had a profound impact on him. The result, he decided to commit his energies and finances to the formation of a socialist community at Manea Fen, and he corresponded with Owen to outline his plans and met with Owen's approval. The main aim was to construct, based on Owen's models, a quadrangle of buildings with at the center this vast 60-foot lookout tower from which all the village would be constructed. This is one of these kind of interesting questions we'll come to. Was the tower ever constructed? As far as we can see, it wasn't. Another great might have been. Now, in many ways, compared to a lot of other utopian enterprises of the 19th century that didn't get off the ground at all, the Hodsonian community can be considered an experiment, a success, in that it did happen. Officially, it lasted 3.5 years, disbanding in 1841. As we can see that from our archaeological investigations, it seems to have lingered longer. But the fact that it survived at all. Archaeologically, it's also quite interesting because, in terms of 19th century studies, to actually get a series of closed archaeological contexts, like pits or something, that that date to such a short time frame is very, very important, because it will tell you what is contemporary, what types of pottery, what types of clay pipe, etc., is contemporary within a very short period of time. So potentially very, very interesting indeed. Now, in 1838, Hobson bought a tract of land 1.25 miles long by 1.5 miles wide in the Manea 50s. And it was intended that the costs that Hobson incurred in the purchase of the land would be reimbursed over time by the colonists as they gained in self-sufficiency and financial security. Now, the land was held to be attractive based on 3 factors. First, it was cheap. And there was, according to Hobson, really the sense of general ignorance of the quality of the Fenland itself. And he was adamant that with his skills and knowledge of soil nutrition, and in terms of his knowledge of experimental agricultural techniques, he could make it the best farmland in the world. Secondly, though not shown on the 1833 maps, there was apparently a clay pit already there, and as a result could provide building materials for the site. And third, perhaps most importantly, was the proximity of the old Bedford River, the superhighway of the Fens, which enabled immediate transport and export of products to and from the colony. Now, one suspects also the very remoteness of the site was also considered to be attractive for the formation of such a community, the sense that it was away from the influence of modern industry and also the state system itself. Now, I'm picking the site's later usage from the early colony structures is both a significant task, and it's proven fairly difficult. And so, in a sense, we need to look at the cartographic map history of what might be anticipated from the site and its archaeology. And you can see here the sense that there's the expectation of quarry. We know that there are orchards, windmills, and also eventually a brickyard. In terms of the buildings on the 1886 and 1900 OS maps, that's rather grandiose, the way the number of buildings that are in fact being shown. And the difficulty I'll come to in a minute is the detection of any of these archaeologically. What is interesting in a couple of cases is that the earlier maps indicate already that there were two buildings present on the site prior to the colony's establishment proper. Now, the question of what kind of sources there are actually available in terms of use for information. So on one hand, we do have the local National Archive, we have the censuses, we've got letters and personal documents, of which there's a fair amount, but also sales brochures and land surveys. Now, one of the most important sources is the Working Bee, which was the weekly newspaper produced by the colony itself. And it had various descriptions of milestones, achievements, and also their ambitions. Much of it is written in a kind of slightly odd manner in response to outsider critique of it, so that there are aspects of its source accuracy is open to question. And again, some of the plans, the engravings that you see of the site, like the one in the bottom, it is questionable how much of it was actually built and how much of it was in effect wish fulfillment. So for the archaeological program that we were able to do this September, essentially its goals were fourfold: to assess the preservation and character of the archaeology, to try to establish and bring together people who were working and researching into the colony, and that's been quite successful. We've made a contact with a number of historians working out of London. We had a very good sort of day school meeting in Manea itself. To collate unidentified or underused resource material, and also quite simply to determine the potential for areas of future archaeological investigation. The portion of the site that was looked at archaeologically in September, we divided it into 50 20-meter squares, and the first stage was to look at these in terms of geophysical survey and excavation. So we used two types of geophysical survey. One was resistivity, which can work well on clays if there's enough moisture on the ground. We did get some fairly good results, even though September was unusually hot and dry. The technique of magnetometry, which basically measures burnt disturbance, is often less successful in clay soils, in that clay itself can have quite a high magnetic background. But it is very good at identifying burnt areas and brick structures, especially if in terms of fired clay. And so that really worked quite well in this case. The other technique we used was field walking collection with the material collected by 20-meter grid, and that helps identify different hot spots in terms of occupation and the usage of the site. And finally, of course, is trial trench investigation itself. So we were able to open 7 trenches this year, and one fairly large area of excavation. So the trenches themselves. And as a result of this, we were able to identify, it was surprising how much archaeology survived. There was a risk that it had entirely been plowed out. The topsoil, it's a very depleted soil horizon, so you're only looking at about 30 centimeters of plow soil left above. But we did get good, some degree of archaeological survival. So saying we've got 4 phases. The first phase represents the pre-colony land use, which is largely being represented in this case by marling pits. Okay, it's to dig down to get the marl out to mix with the peat topsoil because it's being depleted at the time. Okay. It is uncertain how much, in fact, at the time, how much of this marling relates to the immediate pre-use, or if in some of it, the marling might actually be significantly earlier and actually predate enclosure itself. The second phase is the 19th century occupation, which basically dates to the colony proper. And the structural remains included sunken brickline pits with floors, pits itself, post holes, and various boundary ditches. We were able to excavate 2 brickline structures which had these laid brick floors, which are probably some sort of tank system, possibly for cess. And also associated with it was a couple quite nice pits. Very nice, very rich pit here. We'll show the material from this. But generally, the nature of the clay subsoil, very horrible soil to have to work on, very insensitive geology in terms of archaeology. Now, the brick structures consisted of 3 to 4 courses of brick. A number of the bricks were imprinted with the word drain, because apparently after 1826, any material used in the construction of drainage-related schemes was exempt from taxation as long as the word drain was imprinted on it. This tax was eradicated by 1850, so we've got a 24-year-long date line for the manufacture of this material. So it does suggest that basically this use of the structures, it could be an early form of tax evasion, but there is some risk that they're reusing, that they're slightly later in date and they're reusing earlier brick types. Now, the magnetometry geophysical survey did register a number of quite high readings in the vicinity of the brick structures, identified themselves, and also other such, which gives targets for should further work decide to go into the area. And then equally, there's the sense that are we identifying, in this case, another row of terrace cottages connected to such brick structures. Now, the pit that I just showed adjacent to one of the 2 brick structures was fully excavated and included a lot of early 19th century material, falling in line with the date of the usage of the colony. And some of the material is quite interesting, including potentially the beer barrel tap key, because we know in records that they had a brewer house. The other thing that is quite interesting is the relationship between decorated and undecorated pottery. It brings into some questions about the cooperative ideals of the community's sense of equality and how much personal display space, for example, were they allowed for their own familial items. Industrial activity was also represented by hearth waste that we found in the bottom of the pit, probably deriving from metalworking. There were also glass droplets cut off during the process of glass making. So there is an aspect of industry going on to the site that doesn't seem to be registering, that we have yet to find in the documentary evidence. The other thing that is quite interesting is that the preservation within the pit was surprisingly good. So not only are we getting buttons and leather shoes, but also pieces of cloth. And these are currently in the process of being cleaned for analysis at this time. We've also got domestic waste in the case of bone dumps found across the site. These are not easily datable. You can see the sense of big dump of sheep bone in this case. But they may provide some sense of the culinary habits of the inhabitants. There's also a series of, one of the things we're getting, the number of clay pipes, 3 of which are showing that they're being manufactured in Wisbech in the early mid-19th century. And again, these give quite important datums in terms of untangling the site sequence. The third phase of occupation relates to its 20th century usage, where essentially we're finding really quite large dumps of intact and broken glass bottles, tin kettles, basins, and a lot of locally made produce. It is difficult to tell whether, to what degree we're seeing some degree of later 19th and early 20th century occupation, or to what degree it's being used just as a convenient dump. But again, our investigations were really quite limited given the size of the site. Equally, we're getting animal burials, dog and pig in this case. Seems to be relating to these dumping horizons, like you can see up here. This is the kind of dump material we're getting, but also dumps of, in this case, probably a sick animal, and here a part thereof. Occupation altogether, which is basically evidenced by the very muchly apparent plow marks on the site. Now, basically, these are not normally of archaeological interest, but they do seem to represent something quite significant. These sort of trencher machines also, and they would seem their intention was to dislodge the original building's foundations. And they seem to have been largely successful in this case, so they've eradicated most of the traces. Nonetheless, there are marks that leave some shadows of the formal buildings. In this case, you can see the sense of the way that the image is registering. So it does suggest that the geophysics, that you are seeing the range where the brick foundations have been removed. So, now, while the analysis of this season's fieldwork is still underway, the potential, I think that the site clearly has a great deal of potential. And it illustrates that with the exception, I think we have to say, can say at this time, with the exception of the sunken floor buildings, that the main foundations seem to have been removed. And this leads us to question the nature of the construction of the buildings. There are a number of post holes that we found, which might suggest there were quite a few timber buildings, but this could also demonstrate that timber formed the skeleton of the buildings, which brick was basically added as some sort of almost in a skin structure. What is interesting in this, that there's a distinctly temporary feel to the whole thing, and not a sense of that they're being building for the long term. I'm certain they had awareness that it was, not going to last more than 3 years, but the sense that things are not deeply footed there. Again, it's quite promising the kind of pitting we're getting in these brickline structures. It means it does have archaeological potential. What the brickline structures actually are, we're not certain yet. Finally, there's the sense of the degree of late 19th and early 20th century usage, which itself is quite interesting, clearly needs further investigation, and it could be an interesting area to gather, I think, oral histories of, and because the site certainly attracted a great deal of local interest. So the Manea Colony excavations marks the end of our Ouse Washes work, which last year included the public excavation at Erith's Bulwark and also the Roman villa on the RSBP reserve lands at Fenland. In doing this, I mean, we've had altogether now over, I would have to think it's about 150 volunteers participating in the digs. And I have to say, from our point of view, it's only been an entirely gratifying experience. And I think it's their participation and enthusiasm that's been key to the whole thing. To me, it's given a really great opportunity to sort of use archaeology to testify to the idea that there are other stories in the Fenland landscape and something beyond just these sort of too widely cited wily marsh dweller cliches that so often get trotted out. There seems to me there's just a lot of other Fenland stories, Fenland narratives, also signs of Fenland science that archaeology can particularly bring to light and the sense of document what is left of its remains. So I would sincerely like to thank Mark and the partnership team in this case for the unique opportunity which this project has afforded to look at some really, really interesting local archaeology. So thanks very much.